I once killed 62 tomato plants in a single summer, not all at once. They went in waves like the verse of a sad song nobody asked for. I watered them with the dedication of a man who had just read 3 articles. I fertilized them with a bright blue powder that promised the world. I tilled the soil every weekend until it had the texture of cocoa powder, because I had decided that was what good farmers did. By August, the survivors looked like they had been through customs at a small airport. The few tomatoes that ripened tasted like wet paper. My neighbor, who grew his in what looked like a pile of half-rotted leaves and old burlap, walked over one afternoon and handed me a paper bag of his with the top folded shut. I took one home, sliced it on the counter, ate it standing up, and made a small involuntary noise that my dog heard from another room. That was the summer I started reading about permaculture, mostly out of spite. Here's the thing. The mistakes I made in that backyard, the bare soil and the chemical fix and the constant disturbance and the obsession with one perfect crop are exactly the same mistakes industrial agriculture makes at the scale of continents. The same shape scaled up, and the bill for those mistakes is starting to come due. A Cornell University researcher named David Pimentel published a paper in 2006 with a number nobody wanted to read. American farmland is losing topsoil 10 times faster than it can be replaced. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization put out a report in 2015 that said roughly 1/3 of the world's soil is already degraded. The state of Iowa, which had something like 14 inches of topsoil when settlers first plowed it in the 1850s, has about 6 inches left in some places. We are eating the land we eat off of. You would expect this to be the headline of every newspaper. It is not, because soil disappears slowly, and the markets that price food don't price its absence. Before we get to the Australians in the book, you need to know why industrial agriculture got like this in the first place, because it didn't happen by accident. In the early 20th century, 2 German chemists named Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch figured out how to pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia. That single invention, the Haber-Bosch process, made synthetic fertilizer cheap and plentiful. Roughly half the people alive on the planet today are eating food grown with nitrogen produced by that reaction. It is responsible for feeding billions of human beings, and it is also responsible for the slow exhaustion of soil microbial life on every continent it touched. 40 years later, an American plant breeder named Norman Borlaug developed dwarf wheat varieties that, paired with synthetic fertilizer and irrigation, tripled yields in India and Mexico almost overnight. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. The Green Revolution, as it was called, pulled close to 1 billion people back from the edge of starvation in real time. It also locked the entire global food system into one pattern: high inputs, vast monocultures, exhausted ground. Permaculture wasn't born to argue against any of that. It was born to figure out what comes after it. Which brings us to 2 Australians and a small book. Bill Mollison was a Tasmanian researcher who spent years studying marsupial populations in temperate rainforests, and who, by his own description, hated lawnmowers in the way other people hate landlords. David Holmgren was his graduate student, 27 years younger, also Tasmanian, quieter. Together, in 1978, they published a book called Permaculture 1. The word was their invention, a smashing together of permanent and agriculture. The central idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Stop fighting nature to make it produce one thing. Instead, design systems that copy how nature already produces many things at once. Don't grow a field of corn. Grow a forest that happens to feed you. The genius wasn't in the techniques themselves. Most of those existed already in indigenous farming systems from the Amazon to the Pacific Northwest. The genius was in the order of operations. Mollison insisted that a designer spend a full year observing a piece of land before placing anything on it. Where does the water move after rain? Which corner of the property gets frost first? Which way does the morning wind come from in April? Where do the deer cross? What grows there on its own that nobody planted? Most farms get planted on a calendar. A permaculture site gets planted on a memory. Mollison himself spent close to 8 years observing his own hillside in Tasmania before he planted a serious food forest on it. 8 years. By the end of that period, he could tell you the exact line on his property where the morning fog rolled to in October. He had drawn a map of every wild tree and shrub that grew there before he arrived. He kept a notebook of the birds and the order they appeared each spring. When he finally put fruit trees in the ground, he placed each one in roughly the location its wild cousin had thrived in for generations. Almost none of them died. Almost none of them needed watering past the first season. That observation step is where the whole discipline lives or dies, and it is the single rule industrial agriculture broke first. In 2001, a British permaculturalist named Geoff Lawton flew to Jordan with a small crew and tried to grow vegetables in a hot, salty piece of land about 10 kilometers from the Dead Sea. The soil there was so saline, you could see white crystals on the surface in the morning, like a thin layer of frost in the wrong climate. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Local farmers had given up on the parcel decades earlier. Lawton's team dug long, shallow ditches across the slope on the contours to catch the rare and violent flash rains. They covered every inch of bare ground with straw, old wool blankets, and woody mulch. They planted nitrogen-fixing trees first, fruit trees second, vegetables last. Within 4 months, a fig tree on that land produced its first fruit. Within 2 years, the soil in the test plot was sweet enough to taste without making a face. He filmed all of it. The footage is still online and looks like a magic trick performed in slow motion by a man with a clipboard. Lawton wasn't doing anything any traditional farmer hadn't done somewhere before. He was just doing all of it at once, on purpose, in the right order. What that project also quietly demonstrated was a second Mollison principle, one that sounds at first like a koan. The problem is the solution. The desert is too hot. Good. Use the heat. Build rock terraces that absorb solar radiation in the day and release it as warmth at night, and grow figs and dates in the protected microclimates between them. The water arrives in a violent flash and then disappears. Good. Channel each flash into long earthen trenches that pull the water sideways into the soil over weeks, instead of letting it scour the surface in minutes. There are no available nutrients in the dirt. Good. Plant nitrogen-fixing trees first and let them feed the layers that follow. Permaculture's strangest trick is that it refuses to define any natural condition as a deficit. It treats every problem on a piece of land as an unused asset that nobody has gotten around to thinking about yet. I want to stop here for a moment because if you have watched this far, you might be wondering what any of this has to do with your life. You don't have 100 acres, you don't run a farm, you came to a gardening channel because you wanted to know what to plant in May. So here's the part that changes the temperature of the whole conversation. Permaculture didn't get invented to save the planet. It got invented to give back something specific that industrial farming took from a lot of people, which is the experience of land that gets better every year instead of worse. That feeling is available to you on a balcony. It is available to you on a windowsill. It is the same logic, only scaled down. Everything I am about to describe at the scale of farms applies to a 4x8 raised bed in a suburban backyard. You are not just a witness to any of this. You are a participant, whether you want it to be or not. All right, continuing. A man named Mark Shepard bought 106 acres of worn-out cornfield in Wisconsin in 1995 and decided to plant trees instead, hazelnuts and chestnuts in long, curving rows along the contours of his slopes. Between those rows, apples and grapes. Between those, currants and asparagus. Pigs and cattle rotated through the system on a schedule. He called the approach restoration agriculture and wrote a book about it in 2013 by that name. The point of all the stacking, the planting of 3 things where most farms grow 1, was a principle Mollison called stacking functions. Every element in a well-designed system does at least 3 jobs. A chicken eats kitchen scraps, lays eggs, and tills the soil. A pond catches runoff, raises fish, and reflects light onto the south wall of a greenhouse. A row of black locust trees feeds bees, fixes nitrogen, drops firewood every 5 years, and shades the lettuce in July. Industrial agriculture asks 1 question of the land. Permaculture asks 5 at the same time. The most absurd example of this happened in China on a piece of land called the Loess Plateau. About the size of Belgium, ringed by the Yellow River, the plateau had been farmed badly for so many centuries that 1990 satellite photos showed it as a kind of beige scar visible from low orbit. Starting in 1994, the Chinese government and the World Bank funded a restoration project there. They built terraces, they planted trees, they paid farmers to stop grazing certain slopes for 10 years. By 2005, the satellites showed green. A filmmaker named John D. Liu spent 15 years documenting the change, and the before and after frames look like 2 different countries. They were the same country. The land had simply been allowed to do what land does when nobody is actively fighting it. There's also a quieter case for permaculture that doesn't get made often enough on YouTube, and it has nothing to do with the planet. It has to do with the income statement. A market garden called Singing Frogs Farm, run by Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser in Sebastopol, California, sits on roughly 3 acres of intensively planted no-till beds. They use compost instead of synthetic fertilizer. They keep the soil covered all year. They harvest the same beds 8 or 9 times per season instead of once. The revenue per acre, last time it was published, was several times the regional average for conventional vegetable farms in California. A different kind of farmer, named Joel Salatin, runs a multi-species grazing operation called Polyface Farm in Swoope, Virginia, which became famous after the writer Michael Pollan profiled it in The Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006. Lawton's farm earns more revenue per acre than most industrial dairies. The reason is not magic. It is that he is selling 4 different products from the same square foot of grass instead of 1. Industrial agriculture optimizes for volume per acre. Permaculture optimizes for revenue per acre. Those are different math problems, and the second one, quietly, wins more often than the first. The honest objection to all of this is that it sounds beautiful and works slowly. The world has 8 billion people in it. We can't tell them to wait while somebody plants nitrogen-fixing trees. That objection is real, and the permaculture community sometimes pretends it isn't, but it misreads the math. The Rodale Institute, a research farm in Pennsylvania, has been running side-by-side trials of conventional and regenerative methods since 1981. 40-plus years of data on the same soil, in the same climate, with the same crops. The headline finding, repeated decade after decade, is that once the regenerative systems are mature, their yields match conventional yields in normal years, and they outperform conventional yields in drought years by margins large enough to be uncomfortable for the industry. The question isn't whether the land can feed us. The question is whether we're patient enough to let the land figure out how. This is roughly where I started, standing in my backyard, holding a paper bag of someone else's tomatoes, realizing the difference between him and me wasn't dedication, it was direction. I was treating the soil like a problem to solve. He was treating it like a tenant he hadn't met yet. I still grow tomatoes. They go in last now. They go in after the comfrey and the white clover and the chopped up leaf mulch that I leave on the bed all winter, looking to most passersby like I forgot to clean up. The neighbors probably still think I am bad at this. The tomatoes every August suggest otherwise.